Developing a National Energy Strategy, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. With a burgeoning global demand for energy, political instability among key oil producers, and a growing recognition of the impacts of climate change, energy policy will likely assume a prominent place on the next American president's agenda. Many complain that Washington has been slow to articulate a coherent national energy strategy. Finding a politically tenable balance between economic interests, national security, and environmental concerns has proven difficult. State and local governments have begun to offer their own policy responses, but given the scope of the challenges, a truly effective energy strategy must be devised at the national level. To help us explore these issues and some possible policy solutions, we're joined today by Paul Bledsoe, Director of Communications and Strategy for the National Commission on Energy Policy, an independent bipartisan group of leading energy experts. He previously served in the Clinton administration as Director of Communications of the White House Climate Change Task Force and as Special Assistant to U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt. Paul, welcome to Milwaukee and to International Focus.
Thanks.
Well, this is a subject we've been engaged with for quite some time, and if I could, I'd like to begin our discussion by reading a quote here from someone involved in formulating policy. He says, "I'm inaugurating a program to marshal both government and private research with the goal of producing an unconventionally powered, virtually pollution-free automobile within 5 years." A few years later, he made another statement, "Let this be our national goal. At the end of this decade, the United States will not be dependent on any other country for the energy we need to provide our jobs, heat our homes, and to keep our transportation moving." And of course, the speaker was Richard Nixon in the mid-1970s.
Every president since 1973 in the Arab oil embargo has pledged that the United States will be energy independent. Since that time, we have become more energy dependent on nations around the world. Right now, we import about 60% of our petroleum, for example. It causes one to wonder if this is the wrong goal. Our group actually thinks it is the wrong goal. It's a silly goal. It's a global market. Oil is priced and produced globally, and the notion that we are going to cut ourselves off from the world and have our own supplies of energy and ours alone is just not a recognition of the global marketplace. I think a more thoughtful solution would be to develop alternative long-term technologies that can help replace, for example, imported oil from the Middle East over a long period of time. That's probably a much more reasonable set of policy goals.
Well, I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit at the outset about your group.
The National Commission on Energy Policy, as you said, is a group of business leaders, environmentalists, consumer group leaders, and others who came together about 5 years on a bipartisan basis to put together specific policies for the President and Congress to consider when crafting energy policy. We released initial recommendations in 2004, many of which were included in the 2005 Energy Bill. We released recommendations last April, many of which were included in the Energy Bill just passed in December. Especially the major recommendation that was included in December's bill was raising fuel economy of American automobiles by a mile per gallon per year from about 24 miles per gallon on average to 35 by 2020. That's the first increase by Congress of fuel economy in 30 years.
So, it sounds like many of these kinds of prescriptions were around for a while. I mean, what has changed in the environment to make you more hopeful that some of this will actually happen?
The two or three things are kind of new on the energy scene. The first is global climate change. there's growing consensus among the world's, not just scientists, but political leaders. President Bush has said that climate change is caused by man-made emissions and needs to be addressed. So there's general consensus that that issue has to be dealt with. That means reworking basically the entire energy infrastructure, both in the United States and the globe. Today in the United States, we get, for example, 50% of our electricity from coal, 96% of our transportation fuel is from oil or oil-based substitutes. So we're heavily reliant on fossil fuels, which of course emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So climate change is really the new kid on the block. What's interesting is that all three presidential candidates still in the race support mandatory limits on U.S. climate change emissions, and that's a very important step forward. A lot of people believe that it's climate change legislation that's going to lead to development of and deployment of new clean energy technologies that basically change the U.S. and eventually the global energy infrastructure.
Well, one of the differences between the candidates, and I would argue between the parties as they've articulated a platform, is the role of government versus the private sector in developing those kinds of things. Does your organization come down on one side of the issue or the other?
As I said, we're half Republican, half Democrat, both in our commissioners and our staff, and yet this group came to consensus recommending mandatory limits on U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. The system we would use is one that now all the major bills in Congress advocate, which is to cap global U.S. emissions of greenhouse gases and create a market for these permits to pollute.
If you could explain, we've referenced cap and trade kinds of schemes before. If you could explain a bit how they work.
Okay, so how it basically would work is the emissions of the entire economy would be capped, and major emitters, in the case of the leading legislation, this would be oil refineries, coal-fired utilities, and natural gas pipelines. Those would be the regulated entities. And so they would buy and sell permits to emit greenhouse gas emissions. The thing to understand is that what you're doing is you're putting a price on emitting carbon. Right now, if you emit greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, it's free. You're free to do so. After this bill passes, which I expect will happen in 2009 or 2010, there'll be a price for doing it, let's say $20 a ton of CO2. Well, that's going to incentivize non-polluting sources, make them a lot more competitive. Over time, as that price will likely go up, in Europe it's trading for about 30 euros a ton of carbon right now. Europe already has a system like this. It's going to incentivize a whole series of new technologies which are now not cost competitive. The other thing it does is it raises revenue for the government. This is a $100 billion to $200 billion a year market that will be created. Some of that money will be used for government-led research, development, and deployment. Interestingly, John McCain was one of the leaders in developing this legislation. As a senator, he supported it, and so do Senators Obama and Senator Clinton. So the likelihood that the new president will not only support this legislation, but push for its enactment in 2009, 2010 is very high. A lot of us believe that this will be the main driver for a revolution in energy technology. It's worth pointing out that some of this revolution is already happening, mostly because of high prices. As all your viewers know, oil is now over $100 a barrel. Gasoline is about $3.50. And those high prices are incentivizing a whole lot of substitutes. Most people have so far focused on corn ethanol, but the truth is you can't produce too much corn ethanol until you start running into food supply and other agricultural problems. There are other substitutes that have a greater potential to produce more of our domestic transportation fuel, in particular cellulosic ethanol. And that's ethanol made from farm wastes, from purpose-grown crops like switchgrass that can be grown on marginal croplands. So there are other technologies beyond ethanol that can be used to help provide alternative transportation fuels as well.
Well, Going back to the cap and trade schemes now, is there any effort to incorporate a larger sort of multinational cap and trade kind of scheme?
It's a good question. So under the Kyoto Protocol, which the U.S. helped negotiate but did not submit under the Clinton administration, where I worked, did not submit for ratification by the U.S. Senate, and then ultimately the Bush administration withdrew from the entire process. Under that system, individual nations can meet their targets however they wish. They didn't have a cap and trade system. It just so happened that the Americans sold the Europeans on a cap and trade system, and the Europeans have adopted it. So now Europe does have a cap and trade system for emissions, but other places like Japan do not operate with a cap and trade system. Canada has started to experiment with a hybrid. So this isn't to say that only cap and trade is the only way this will happen. I think it's more likely that the U.S. will have a U.S.-wide emissions limiting system and market for some period before it links to, say, a European system. I think there are people who believe that ultimately what you want is a global price on carbon emissions in China, India, everywhere around the world. I see that as very far down the line. I think first the U.S. needs to cap its own emissions as, you know, the world's largest economy and the largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions. Once we get that under our belt, I would say it would be probably 5 or 10 years at least before we would link to any other system. I do think, though, ultimately the notion is if you place a high enough price on carbon emissions, you're going to incentivize a revolution in energy technology development. Not just wind and solar, but different kinds of biomass, tidal energy, hydrogen eventually energy, a whole series of delivery systems that we're not necessarily certain are going to develop now, and we'll leave it up to essentially the private sector and the market to determine which of those wins out. Establishing a carbon price is a way to make that revolution happen. By the way, I mean, policymakers are not doing this just because they want to see a new energy system. They're doing it because the threats of climate change, most scientists believe, are very dire indeed. Al Gore's movie and book have had a lot to do with popularizing it, but the truth is that leaders around the world, in Europe, but also in Africa, in Asia, and elsewhere, are deeply concerned about this issue.
Well, I'm going to stop you there before we go to our break, and I want to get into a little bit of some of the other levels of government that have tried to address some of these issues. So we'll be back in just a moment on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about a national energy strategy with Paul Bledsoe. Well, Paul, just before the break, we were talking a bit about sort of the national schemes that have been put forth and talking a little bit about sort of sub-levels of government that have tried to address this. And I'd like to, if I could, read you a quote from Governor Schwarzenegger in response to the EPA's recent decision to not allow California to regulate tailpipe emissions. He says, quoting here, "It's bad enough that the federal government has yet to take the threat of global warming seriously, but it borders on malfeasance for it to block efforts of states such as California and Connecticut that are trying to protect the public's health and welfare." So what about this? I mean, what has the role of the states been on a lot of these policies?
The states have been leaders in the fight against climate change, but more broadly on experimentation with different kinds of energy production. As you know, states actually regulate the siting and licensing of most, say, electricity power plants. So if there's a coal-fired power plant or a wind farm, a windmill farm, or a nuclear power plant, there's some federal issues involved, but mostly it's the states who do the licensing and regulating. The same's true with transmission lines for power supply. So the states have a very big role in this. California, about 10 Northeast states and others have attempted to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. California in particular wanted to regulate emissions from tailpipes and asked for a waiver from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency to do so. People were a little startled that the Bush administration opposed this waiver, which had never happened before. Every waiver previous to this had been granted in history, some 50 waivers. And I think the general view of the Bush administration, if I can explain it adequately, is that the legislation just passed by Congress would have raised fuel economy standards close to the level that the California process would have brought them. And so they believe that the federal effort has already reached what California proposed. Californians disagree very strongly with that. Ultimately, much of this legislation at the state level is going to end up in the courts, and this will still be fought out in the courts.
Well, one of the things that I think many people found striking about the California initiative was Governor Schwarzenegger and others actually reaching out beyond U.S. borders. I think he met with some people on the EU side and talking about joining their cap-and-trade system. What do you think this is feasible at all? I mean,
no, I don't think it's feasible, and the notion that that ultimately the states are going to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, even the states themselves don't believe that. They say that they would prefer a federal system, and a federal system, as I say, I do think is coming. It is not going to be easy to pass because essentially what you're doing when you regulate greenhouse gas emissions and set up a program to reduce them and put a price on their emissions is you're raising energy taxes. Now, you're probably raising them in pretty small ways comparatively. Maybe initially a dime for a gallon of gasoline. Maybe initially 5 or 10% for an electricity bill, but still, for many Americans, that's an important amount. One of the things that's been talked about in Congress is using some of the revenue from the cap-and-trade system to recycle back to low-income families and households to make up for that increased cost of energy. So that's one of the things that's going to be talked about in Congress. But the notion that the states have provided leadership on this, but ultimately they can't solve the problem. The other thing is companies can't be expected to deal with 20 different state regulations when it comes to energy policy. So there's a vacuum created by the state action that I think the federal government needs to fill.
Well, in the same way that states are probably not the unit of government to address this, we touched a little bit earlier on the need for some sort of concerted international effort in concert. How important is that ultimately, do you think, that we do have something along the lines of Kyoto that the U.S. can subscribe to?
I think ultimately this is a global problem, and it's got to be solved globally. I think that the most important initial steps, though, need to be taken by the developed countries, the Western countries, industrialized countries, partly because they have the technology to do so more cheaply, partly because they set global conditions on the world market. The notion is that once the U.S. accepts limits on greenhouse gases emissions, they'll be in a position to put pressure on other nations, especially major developing nations like China, India, and Brazil, to do the same. As a matter of fact, the legislation that our group helped write in Congress has specific provisions that call for comparable action over time by major developing countries like China, India, and Brazil. And would ask any new president to review the carbon mitigations of those other countries once we adopt a program to make sure that they're coming along in line. Ultimately, it's going to involve a global price on carbon, but also global technology sharing. And that's going to be a big part, I think, of the new president's agenda, too. The G8 nations have talked about this for several years, initially led by Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister. Now Gordon Brown is interested in this. Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany, and others are pushing this, that the G8 process, the global leaders of the West, get involved in putting together large energy technology programs that initially would start in the West but could involve transfer to places like China and India. In this regard, Chinese emissions of greenhouse gases have passed American emissions sometime in the last 2 or 3 months. So China is, in fact, the largest emitter now. The Chinese, I've been in some of these international negotiations, the Chinese argue that while they may be just have become the largest emitter, they're not responsible for the 100 years of emissions that are actually raising temperatures. Your viewers should know that CO2 stays in the atmosphere for 100 years. So the emissions that we've been accumulating for the last century are what's causing the current warming. The final thing to say on the international front is I do not believe the U.S. is going to accept any global treaty on climate change. I don't believe that's the way it's going to occur. I think we will get our own house in order, restrict emissions from the U.S., and then begin the process of discussing a global framework. Some people have called this global federalism, where individual countries take responsibility for their own actions. Then once countries are starting to act, then you can come together to the negotiating table, rather than having the rest of the world try to beat individual countries into compliance, which frankly has not worked very well under the Kyoto system.
Well, if we look at the EU, there was a broad consensus on what needs to be done. But recently, when representatives from individual countries met and they tried to hash out exactly what each individual nation would be responsible for, you find it's a very different situation when it gets down to specifics.
That's right. I mean, every nation has its own attributes and its own energy profile that makes its system unique. And the international community shouldn't try to force every nation to comply in the same way. I think that once the U.S., however, does accept mandatory limits on greenhouse gas emissions, then you have about half the global economy with a system of enforcing emissions, slightly more actually than half the global economy. And then you're in a position to sort of tilt the balance toward new, clean, low-emission technologies being more competitive. And I think once the U.S. does adopt a mandatory climate change regime, I would think that most of the rest of the world would have pretty severe limits within 10 or 15 years. A final thing to say, and we have labor leaders in our group and CEOs of major electric utilities, and they complain about competitive advantage that the Chinese and other nations might have if we adopt a program and they don't. Well, first of all, the Europeans complain about that right now because they are undertaking a program and we're not. But the truth is that in terms of cost of production, energy and the amount that a carbon levy would put on any product is a very small factor of production compared to, say, labor costs. So this is probably not a very reasonable argument. I do think you're going to hear a lot of it in the next 2 years as Congress gets real about fighting climate change.
Well, we've got just a few minutes left, and with deference to your bipartisan nature, I'd like you to comment a little bit about sort of the energy policy rhetoric you've heard in the campaign from both sides.
Well, interestingly, as I may have mentioned before, for the first time ever, we have the three likely presidents, McCain, Obama, and Clinton, all support mandatory greenhouse gas emission reductions. They all are very close on the fuel economy regulation question. There are some differences in spending on energy technology. Senator McCain is a strong advocate, for example, of nuclear power. I should note that Senators Obama and Clinton have not ruled out nuclear power, but they're probably not as strong advocates as McCain is. What's most interesting is how much agreement there is. among the candidates on energy policy. That's not necessarily true of the parties in Congress, however. Traditionally, over the last 10 years, the Democrats have pushed an agenda of regulating greenhouse gas emissions, higher taxes on the major oil companies, and incentivizing clean energy technology. Republicans traditionally have opposed higher taxes on the oil companies. As a matter of fact, they beat off a tax bill that would have done that just last December, and have instead suggested that we provide bigger incentives for investments by those oil companies in U.S. domestic oil fields. One thing worth talking about is foreign policy and energy. As most of your viewers know, more than 3/4 of the world's known oil reserves are in the Middle East. What they may not know is that may not be the most important statistic. The most important statistic may be that more than 4 out of 5 global oil reserves are in the hands of government-owned entities, corporations, but owned by Saudi Arabia and Venezuela and Iran. And these are not owned by American shareholders, nor are they do they have to deal with corporate rules of governance that in financial capitals. And so that is a little bit of a concern in terms of global balance of power.
Well, I'm going to have to leave you right there. Very interesting, with a topic we're certainly going to hear more of in the waning days of the campaign. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,